Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds like it came straight out of a cyberpunk fever dream. The internet's darkest marketplace, where buying heroin is easier than ordering pizza, and your drug dealer might be halfway across the planet wearing pajamas in his mum's basement. We're talking about the Silk Road and the digital drug revolution that changed everything. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to Sarah from Portland who suggested this topic in the comments. Your curiosity helped shape tonight's story, and that means everything. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you prefer listening there, check out the link in the description. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Have you ever wondered what happens when you combine encryption, anonymity, and criminal enterprise? How does someone build Amazon for illegal drugs? What made thousands of people trust complete strangers with their money, their freedom, and sometimes their lives? Could law enforcement really catch a ghost who operated entirely in ones and zeros? Would you know how to access the dark web if you wanted to? And more importantly, should you? And here's the really unsettling part. What if the war on drugs was actually lost, not in the streets or at borders, but in lines of code written by libertarian computer nerds who believe drugs should be legal anyway? Congratulations. You've just logged into the year 2011, where a website called Silk Road is about to revolutionize crime, destroy lives, make millionaires out of drug dealers, and prove that the internet isn't just for cat videos and conspiracy theories. Welcome to the dark web. Don't forget your password, you're going to need it. Let's rewind to a time before Silk Road, before Bitcoin, before encryption became the drug, dealer's best friend. If you wanted drugs in the early 2000s, you had three options. Know a guy who knows a guy, or wander into the wrong neighborhood and hope you don't get stabbed, robbed, or arrested. The drug trade was physical, dangerous, and deeply inefficient. Dealers stood on corners, buyers met strangers in parking lots. Everyone involved risked violence, robbery, bad product, and police raids. It was analog crime in a digital age, and honestly, it was only a matter of time before someone figured out how to move the whole mess online. But to understand how we got to the Silk Road, you first have to understand what the internet looked like before it became a criminal paradise. Picture this. It's 2005. You're a college student who wants to buy some weed for the weekend. Your options are limited and sketchy. Maybe you know someone from high school who knows a guy. So you send a vague text message, nothing explicit, because even paranoid, 20-year-olds understand that texts aren't private and arrange to meet in a grocery store parking lot at 11 p.m. You sit in your car, engine running, watching every vehicle that passes, wondering if that sedan is an undercover cop or just someone buying milk. When your dealer finally shows up 20 minutes late, the transaction takes 30 seconds. Money changes hands through a car window. A plastic baggie gets shoved into your jacket. You don't count it. You don't inspect it. You just drive away quickly, heart pounding, hoping you didn't just buy oregano wrapped in cellophane. It's inefficient, uncomfortable, and vaguely terrifying. And this was the good scenario. The worst version? You're dealing with someone genuinely dangerous. Someone who carries a weapon. Someone who operates out of a trap house where things can go sideways fast. Violence was always simmering just beneath the surface of the drug trade. Disputes over money, territory, or product quality got settled with fists, knives, or guns. No customer service department, no dispute resolution. Just the law of the street, which was often brutal and always unpredictable. And then there was the quality control problem, or rather, the complete absence of it. You never really knew what you were getting. Your cocaine might be 50% baking soda. Your ecstasy might be meth, bath salts, or just aspirin pressed into a colourful pill. People died from bad product regularly, but there was no Yelp for drug dealers, no way to warn others that the guy selling out of the blue Honda was peddling poison. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was fighting this with the only tools they had: undercover operations, confidential informants, surveillance, and street sweeps. They'd arrest low-level dealers, who'd immediately be replaced. They'd bust mid-level distributors, and someone else would fill the vacuum. It was an endless, expensive, and largely futile cycle. The drug war was being fought on street corners, in back alleys, and along borders, physical spaces that could be watched, raided, and controlled. But here's what nobody was paying attention to. The internet was quietly becoming something new. It wasn't just email and funny videos anymore. Encrypted communication was getting easier. Digital currencies were being theorized. Anonymity tools were being developed. And a certain kind of person, smart, idealistic, and disillusioned with traditional authority, was starting to ask dangerous questions. What if you could move the entire drug trade online? What if you could eliminate the violence, the uncertainty, and the risk of face-to-face transactions? What if you could build a marketplace where strangers could do business safely, anonymously, and efficiently? It sounded impossible until it wasn't. Ross Ulbricht didn't look like a drug kingpin. He looked like someone who'd help you move furniture or explain cryptocurrency at a party you immediately regretted attending. Born in 1984 in Austin, Texas, Ross was smart, polite, and idealistic. The kind of kid who read Ayn Rand and actually believed it. He studied physics at the University of Texas, then moved into materials science at Penn State, dreaming of making solar panels or something noble like that. But somewhere along the way, Ross became disillusioned with traditional career paths and obsessed with libertarian philosophy. He started asking dangerous questions. What if people could trade freely without government interference? What if the war on drugs was fundamentally immoral? And most importantly, what if he could build a platform that made all of this possible? Ross wasn't planning to become a criminal. He was planning to become a revolutionary. In his early 20s, Ross was the kind of person you'd describe as nice, but not particularly memorable. He had friends, but wasn't the life of the party. He dated, but wasn't a romantic. He was into hiking, meditation, and long philosophical conversations about freedom and markets. If you'd met him at a coffee shop in Austin, you'd probably think he was working on some earnest tech startup or writing a blog about sustainable living. But beneath that mild-mannered exterior, Ross was wrestling with big ideas that would eventually consume him entirely. He'd become obsessed with Austrian economics, the libertarian school of thought that argues for minimal government intervention in markets. He read Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, and Friedrich Hayek like they were scripture. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that individuals should have complete autonomy over their own lives, including what they put into their bodies. The war on drugs, to Ross, wasn't just bad policy. It was a moral abomination. Why should the government have the power to tell adults they couldn't use marijuana, psychedelics, or any other substance? Why were millions of people being arrested, imprisoned, and having their lives destroyed over personal choices that harmed no one else? It was, in his mind, tyranny dressed up as public health policy. And here's where Ross's story takes a turn from philosophical dreamer to something darker. He decided he could actually do something about it. Not by running for office or writing op-eds or organising protests. No, Ross wanted to build a system that would make the drug war obsolete. A marketplace so efficient, so secure, and so beyond the reach of law enforcement that it would demonstrate once and for all that prohibition was futile. He started researching. He taught himself advanced web development, cryptography, and server management. He studied Bitcoin, which was still a fringe curiosity in 2010. He learned about Tor, the anonymity network that could hide web traffic from surveillance. And slowly, piece by piece, he began building what would become Silk Road. Ross didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not his family, not his friends, not his girlfriend. He worked, alone in his apartment, hunched over his laptop for hours at a time, coding late into the night. To everyone around him, he was just another aimless postgrad trying to figure out his life. But in reality, Ross was constructing a digital empire. He believed he was on the right side of history. He believed that what he was building would be remembered as a turning point, a moment when individuals reclaim their freedom from an overreaching state. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a pioneer, a digital founding father creating a new kind of society based on voluntary exchange and personal liberty. It's easy, in hindsight, to see the hubris in that belief. But at the time, in that apartment in Austin, Ross Ulbricht genuinely thought he was going to change the world. And in a way he did, just not the way he imagined. Before Silk Road could exist, the world needed something it had never had before: untraceable digital money. Enter Bitcoin, created in 2009 by a mysterious figure or group calling themselves Satoshi Nakamoto. Bitcoin was pitched as a revolution in finance, a currency free from banks, governments, and central control. Transactions were recorded on a public ledger called the blockchain, but the identities behind those transactions could remain completely anonymous. To most people, Bitcoin sounded like nerd fantasy, but to Ross Ulbricht and others like him, it sounded like freedom. No chargebacks, no credit card companies, no paper trails leading back to your real name. Just you, your wallet address, and the mathematical certainty that no one could stop you from spending your digital coins however you wanted. Bitcoin wasn't designed for crime, but it might as well have been gift-wrapped for it. Let's back up for a second and talk about why digital cash was such a problem in the first place. Before Bitcoin, every online transaction left a trail. You couldn't buy something on the internet without using a credit card, PayPal, or a bank transfer, and every one of those methods connected directly to your real identity. Your name, your address, your bank account, all sitting there in some database, ready to be subpoenaed the moment law enforcement came knocking. For legitimate businesses, this was fine. Actually, it was good. Accountability, consumer protection, fraud prevention. But for anyone trying to do something illegal online, it was a deal breaker. You couldn't run a digital drug marketplace if every transaction could be traced back to real people with real addresses. The whole thing would collapse the moment the first arrest warrant was issued. Enter Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever or whatever that was. In 2008, someone using that pseudonym published a white paper titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It proposed something radical, a currency that existed entirely as digital code, that wasn't controlled by any government or institution, and that could be transferred directly between people without intermediaries. The genius of Bitcoin was the blockchain, a public ledger where every transaction was recorded permanently and transparently. But here's the trick. While the transactions were public, the identities weren't. Each user had a wallet address, a long string of random letters and numbers, and you could see that wallet address X sent 5 bitcoins to wallet address Y. But you had no idea who actually controlled those wallets. It was like cash, but digital. You could hand someone money without anyone knowing your name. In the beginning, Bitcoin was worth essentially nothing. Early adopters, cryptography nerds, libertarian tech bros, and the deeply paranoid mined coins on their home computers and traded them on obscure forums. One famous transaction in 2010 involved someone buying 2 pizzas for 10,000 bitcoins. Today, those pizzas would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which tells you everything you need to know about early Bitcoin's perceived value. But for people like Ross Ulbricht, Bitcoin's value wasn't in its price, it was in its properties. It was decentralized, meaning no government could shut it down. It was pseudonymous, meaning you could transact without revealing your identity. And it was irreversible, meaning once a payment was made, it couldn't be charged back or frozen by a bank. Could you use traditional money to buy drugs online? Sure, if you wanted to gift wrap your home address and social security number for the FBI. But with Bitcoin, you could send payment to someone on the other side of the world, and the only thing connecting you was a meaningless string of alphanumeric characters. It wasn't perfect anonymity, we'll get to that later, but it was close enough. And for the first time in history, it was possible to imagine a functioning online marketplace for illegal goods. Bitcoin hadn't been designed with drug dealers in mind. Satoshi's white paper talked about financial sovereignty, peer-to-peer transactions, and liberation from banks. But intention doesn't matter when you build a tool this powerful, and what Ross Ulbricht saw in Bitcoin was simple: the missing piece of the puzzle, the key that would unlock an entirely new kind of criminal enterprise. All he needed now was a way to hide the website itself, and for that he'd need Tor. Here's the irony that keeps on giving. The technology that powered the dark web and enabled Silk Road was actually developed by the United States Naval Research Laboratory. It's called Tor, short for the Onion Router, and it was designed to protect government communications by bouncing internet traffic through multiple encrypted servers around the world. Think of it like a digital game of telephone, except no one knows who's talking or where the message started. By the time your data reaches its destination, it's been scrambled, rerouted, and anonymized so thoroughly that tracking it back to you is nearly impossible. The government released Tor to the public in 2004, hoping that widespread use would make it harder to identify military and intelligence communications. Oops. Because what they accidentally created was the perfect infrastructure for criminals, whistleblowers, journalists, activists, and anyone else who wanted to disappear online. Let's talk about how Tor actually works, because it's both brilliantly simple and impossibly complex. When you use a normal web browser, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, whatever, your internet traffic travels directly from your computer to the website you're visiting. It's like taking a straight highway from point A to point B. Anyone watching that highway, your internet service provider, your government, a hacker on your Wi-Fi network can see exactly where you're going and what you're doing. Tor takes that highway and turns it into a maze. When you use the Tor browser, your internet traffic doesn't go directly to its destination. Instead, it gets encrypted multiple times, like wrapping a package in layer after layer of paper, and then bounced through a random series of volunteer-operated servers called nodes. Each node peels off one layer of encryption, reveals the address of the next node, and passes the package along. By the time your request reaches the actual website, it's been through at least 3 nodes, and no single node knows both where the traffic started and where it's going. The name the Onion Router comes from this layered encryption. Like peeling an onion, each node removes one layer, but no one can see the whole picture. It's genius, really, and it was designed to protect human rights activists in authoritarian countries, intelligence officers in hostile territories, and journalists communicating with sensitive sources. But here's where the government's plan backfired spectacularly. For Tor to work effectively at protecting government communications, it needed to have lots of users, millions of them, if only government agents. Use Tor, then anyone using it would be immediately suspicious. It's like showing up to a party where everyone's wearing the same uniform. You'd stick out instantly. But if millions of regular people used Tor for all kinds of reasons, privacy, anonymity, accessing blocked content, then the government agents could hide in plain sight. So the Naval Research Laboratory did something unprecedented. They released Tor as free, open-source software. They made it available to everyone. They encouraged widespread adoption, and it worked. Tor became the go-to tool for privacy-conscious individuals all over the world. Dissidents in China used it to bypass censorship. Journalists used it to protect their sources. Privacy advocates used it to escape corporate surveillance. And criminals absolutely loved it. Because the same technology that protected a whistleblower in Belarus also protected a drug dealer in Texas. Tor didn't discriminate. It didn't care if you were leaking government documents or selling heroin. It just made you invisible. This created what's called the dark web, a collection of websites that can only be accessed through Tor, identified by strange .onion addresses instead of normal .com URLs. These sites don't show up on Google. They can't be accessed with a regular browser. They exist in a hidden layer of the internet that most people don't even know exists. And in 2011, Ross Ulbricht realized he could build his marketplace there. The government had handed him, completely free of charge, the exact technology he needed to make Silk Road invisible, untraceable, and virtually impossible to shut down. It's like the police accidentally inventing the perfect getaway car and then leaving the keys in the ignition with a note that says, "Please use responsibly. You can't make this stuff up." The US government created the tool that would enable the largest online drug marketplace in history, and by the time they realized what they'd done, it was far too late to put that particular genie back in the bottle. In late 2010, Ross Ulbricht sat down at his computer and started building what would become the most notorious website in internet history. He called it Silk Road, named after the ancient trade route that connected East and West. But instead of spices and silk, this marketplace would deal in drugs, fake IDs, hacking tools, and pretty much anything else that was illegal. Ross coded the entire site himself, working alone in his apartment, teaching himself web development and encryption as he went. The site ran on Tor, accepted only Bitcoin, and operated entirely outside the reach of traditional law enforcement. Vendors could list their products, buyers could browse, review, and purchase, and Ross, operating under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts, would take a commission on every sale. It was e-commerce meets anarchy, Amazon meets Breaking Bad. And in January 2011, Silk Road quietly went live. Ross didn't have a team of developers. He didn't have investors or a business plan or a PR strategy. He had a laptop, an internet connection, and an obsessive determination to make this work. He spent months, maybe longer, teaching himself everything he needed to know. Web design, server configuration, PHP programming, MySQL databases, cryptographic protocols, Bitcoin integration. None of this was his background. Remember, Ross studied physics and materials science. He was supposed to be making solar panels, not building criminal infrastructure. But Ross was smart, methodical, and deeply committed to his vision. He worked 16-hour days, barely sleeping, surviving on cheap takeout and ideology. He studied how legitimate e-commerce sites functioned, Amazon, eBay, Etsy, and tried to replicate their user-friendly interfaces. He wanted Silk Road to feel professional, trustworthy, almost boring. No flashing neon text or sketchy pop-ups, just clean design, intuitive navigation, and a shopping experience that felt normal. The technical challenges were enormous. First, he had to configure the site to run as a Tor hidden service, which meant dealing with onion routing, cryptographic key pairs, and server configurations that most web developers never touch. Then he needed to build the marketplace functionality itself, user registration, product listings, search filters, shopping carts, messaging systems. All of this had to work smoothly while also maintaining anonymity and security. Then there was Bitcoin integration. In 2010, Bitcoin was still experimental, clunky, and barely documented. There were no easy plug-and-play solutions for accepting cryptocurrency payments. Ross had to code it from scratch, creating wallet systems, automating transactions, and building the escrow mechanism that would become Silk Road's defining feature. And he had to do all of this while staying completely anonymous. He couldn't Google how to build a drug marketplace without raising red flags. He couldn't hire contractors or ask for help on developer forums. Every line of code, every bug fix, every security patch, it was all on him. He worked in isolation, paranoid and exhausted. He used multiple layers of encryption, accessed the site only through Tor, and never logged in from the same location twice. He created the identity of Dread Pirate Roberts, borrowing the name from The Princess Bride, where the title was passed down from person to person, making it impossible to catch the real Dread Pirate Roberts. It was a clever bit of misdirection, suggesting from the start that he might not be the only person behind the mask. When Silk Road finally launched in January 2011, it was rough around the edges. The design was functional but basic. There were bugs. The user base was tiny, just Ross, and maybe a handful of people he'd quietly told about it on obscure forums. There were no vendors yet, no products, no reviews, just an empty marketplace sitting in the darkness, waiting. But Ross believed. He believed that if he built it, they would come. He believed that the combination of Tor and Bitcoin had created a window of opportunity, a brief moment in technological history where you could actually build something like this and get away with it. And he was right. Within weeks, the first vendors started appearing. Someone listed magic mushrooms, someone else listed marijuana, then LSD, MDMA, cocaine. The product catalogue grew slowly at first, then faster. Word spread through drug forums, libertarian message boards, and Reddit threads. Curious users downloaded Tor, figured out how to buy Bitcoin, and nervously navigated to Silk Road's .onion address. They expected something sketchy and dangerous. Instead, they found a website that looked like it could sell handmade crafts, except it was selling heroin, and people were buying it, and it was working. Ross Ulbricht, alone in his apartment, had just turned the drug trade into a point-and-click operation. The first transaction on Silk Road wasn't dramatic. No helicopters, no guns, no car chases. Just someone, somewhere, clicking buy now on a listing for magic mushrooms and waiting for a package to arrive in the mail. And then, a few days later, it did. The drugs were real. The transaction was anonymous. The buyer left a 5-star review. And just like that, the future of drug trafficking was born. Word spread quickly through online forums like Reddit and Shroomery. Curious users logged onto Tor, navigated to Silk Road's hidden web address, and discovered a sleek, professional-looking marketplace stocked with every drug imaginable. Weed, MDMA, LSD, cocaine, heroin, all available with customer reviews, competitive pricing and discreet shipping. It was surreal, efficient, and terrifyingly easy. Think about what that first successful transaction meant. For the first time in human history, someone had bought illegal drugs from a complete stranger on the internet and actually received them. No face-to-face meeting, no sketchy parking lot, no risk of violence, just a digital payment to an anonymous vendor and a package arriving in the mailbox a few days later, wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic and disguised as a book or a birthday card. The buyer, whoever they were, must have been nervous. They'd just sent Bitcoin, which in 2011 was still weird internet money that most people didn't understand, to someone they'd never met for drugs that might never arrive, using technology that felt like something out of a spy movie. Every day they waited must have felt like a gamble. What if it was a scam? What if the package got intercepted? What if this whole thing was an FBI honeypot? But then the package arrived. Plain envelope, normal postage, no return address. Inside, exactly what was ordered. The mushrooms were real, properly dried, vacuum sealed to eliminate smell. The stealth packaging worked. The postal service, which handles millions of packages every day, had delivered illegal drugs without knowing it, And here's the moment that changed everything. The buyer went back to Silk Road and left a review. 5 stars. Product arrived quickly. Great quality. Vendor was professional and communicative. Would buy again. That review wasn't just feedback. It was proof of concept. It told every other user browsing Silk Road that this actually worked. You really could buy drugs online. The system wasn't theoretical anymore, it was real. Other users, emboldened by that first success story, started placing orders. More vendors, seeing an opportunity, started listing products. The marketplace began to grow organically, driven by word of mouth and cautious experimentation. Someone would mention Silk Road in a forum thread about where to find good MDMA. Someone else would post a success story on Reddit. A link would get shared. Instructions would be passed around. The early users were mostly tech-savvy drug enthusiasts, people who understood Tor and Bitcoin, or were at least willing to learn. They weren't your typical street buyers. They were college students, programmers, libertarians, psychonauts, people who read Erowid and browsed drug forums and believed in harm reduction. They saw Silk Road as something almost revolutionary, a safer alternative to the violence and uncertainty of street dealing. The beauty of those early transactions was their simplicity and their civility. No one got robbed, no one got shot, no one got arrested. It was just commerce, strange, illegal, underground commerce, but commerce nonetheless. Buyers paid, vendors shipped, packages arrived, reviews were posted. The feedback loop worked. Trust began to build. Ross, watching all of this unfold from behind his screen, must have felt vindicated. His experiment was working. People were using Silk Road exactly as he'd intended, as a peaceful, voluntary marketplace free from coercion and violence. He'd coded the infrastructure, but the community was building itself. Vendors competed on quality and service. Buyers rewarded good vendors with positive reviews and repeat business. Bad actors got called out and pushed out. It was, in Ross's mind, proof that his libertarian ideals could work in practice. You didn't need government regulation or police enforcement. You just needed transparency, accountability, and a system that allowed reputation to matter. The invisible hand of the free market applied to illegal drugs. Of course, he was ignoring a lot of uncomfortable realities. The drugs being sold could still ruin lives. Addiction doesn't care whether you bought your heroin on a street corner or through a website. And the peaceful marketplace he was so proud of was only peaceful because the violence had been outsourced, pushed back to the cartels, the growers, the smugglers who actually produced and transported the drugs before they ever reached Silk Road vendors. But in that moment, watching the first successful transactions roll in, Ross Ulbricht believed he was changing the world. One 5-star review at a time, Ross Ulbricht didn't just run Silk Road, he preached about it. Operating under the username Dread Pirate Roberts, borrowed from The Princess Bride, Ross positioned himself as a visionary, a digital Robin Hood fighting against an unjust system. He wrote manifestos in the site's forums, arguing that the war on drugs was a moral failure, that people should have the right to put whatever they wanted into their own bodies, and that Silk Road was a peaceful revolution against tyranny. He quoted Mises, Rothbard, and Rand. He talked about free markets and individual liberty. He called Silk Road an economic simulation designed to show the world what was possible without government interference. And people listened. To his followers, Dread Pirate Roberts wasn't a drug dealer, he was a hero. But to law enforcement, he was becoming the most dangerous criminal on the internet. Ross fully embraced the persona of Dread Pirate Roberts, or DPR as users called him. He became a presence on the site, not just an administrator, but a philosopher guide, a benevolent dictator who wrote lengthy posts about freedom, morality, and the nature of government power. He didn't hide in the shadows, he engaged. He responded to questions, mediated disputes, and held court in the forums like some kind of digital founding father. His writing was earnest, idealistic, and often genuinely thoughtful. He talked about how the war on drugs had created more violence than the drugs themselves ever could. He pointed out the absurdity of locking people in cages for ingesting substances, especially when alcohol and tobacco, far more dangerous, were perfectly legal. He argued that prohibition had failed, that it would always fail, and that Silk Road was demonstrating a better way. To the growing community of Silk Road users, DPR became a folk hero. He represented resistance against an overreaching state. He stood for personal freedom in an age of increasing surveillance. He was the guy who'd actually built something real, something functional, something that proved you could opt out of the system if you were smart enough and brave enough. Users posted messages of support, almost worshipful in tone. They called him a pioneer, a revolutionary, a legend. Some vendors named their products after him. The forums filled with discussions about libertarian philosophy, Austrian economics, and the morality of drug prohibition. It became a community bound together not just by commerce but by ideology. And Ross leaned into it, hard. He wrote essay-length posts dissecting the philosophy of voluntary exchange. He quoted Rothbard on the non-aggression principle. He referenced Hayek on spontaneous order. He positioned Silk Road not as a criminal enterprise, but as a living experiment in anarcho-capitalism, a proof that markets could self-regulate without government force. He even created a book club, recommending readings to the community: Human Action by Mises, For a New Liberty by Rothbard, Atlas Shrugged by Rand. He wanted to educate his users, to turn them into true believers in the cause. This wasn't just about selling drugs, it was about awakening people to a different way of thinking about power, freedom, and human nature. But here's where things get messy. Because while DPR was writing beautiful manifestos about non-violence and voluntary exchange, the reality behind the scenes was becoming much darker. As Silk Road grew, so did the threats. Competitors emerged. Extortionists demanded payoffs. Hackers tried to breach the site. Law enforcement was closing in, even if Ross didn't know how close. And Ross, increasingly paranoid and isolated, started making decisions that directly contradicted everything Dread Pirate Roberts claimed to stand for. The philosopher king who preached non-aggression was about to become someone willing to order violence, to protect his empire. The mask of DPR, the righteous revolutionary fighting for freedom, was starting to crack, and behind it was Ross Ulbricht, a scared, exhausted young man sitting alone in an apartment, realizing that the ideology he'd built his entire operation on might not survive contact with the real world. But we'll get to that later. For now, in the forums of Silk Road, Dread Pirate Roberts was still a hero, still the voice of revolution, still the man who'd proven that you could build something powerful and beautiful outside the control of governments and corporations. His users believed in him. They trusted him. They thought he was different from every other criminal who'd ever existed. And for a while, maybe even Ross believed it too. But belief, no matter how sincere, doesn't stop the consequences of your actions. And the consequences were coming, inevitable and unforgiving, whether the Dread Pirate Roberts was ready for them or not. So how did you actually buy drugs on Silk Road? Let's walk through it. First, you needed to download Tor and figure out how to navigate the dark web, which for most people felt like trying to read IKEA instructions written in ancient Greek. Once you found Silk Road's web address, a random string of letters and numbers ending in .onion, you'd create an account with a username and password. No real names, no email addresses, just pseudonyms. Then you'd need Bitcoin. You'd buy some on an exchange, transfer it to a Tor-based Bitcoin wallet, and then deposit it into your Silk Road account. From there, you could browse listings like you were shopping on Amazon. Each product had photos, descriptions, prices, and most importantly, customer reviews. Silk Road operated on a reputation system. Vendors with good feedback thrived. Scammers got exposed and banned. When you found what you wanted, you'd place an order, and the Bitcoin would be held in escrow. The vendor would then vacuum seal your drugs, package them in inconspicuous envelopes, and mail them through the postal service. Once you received your order and confirmed it, the Bitcoin was released to the vendor, and Ross took his cut. Let's break down each step because the process, while revolutionary, was also kind of a pain in the arse if you weren't tech savvy. Step 1. Downloading Tor. For your average college student who just wanted some weed, this was already intimidating. You had to go to the Tor project website, download the Tor browser bundle, install it without accidentally downloading malware, and then figure out how it worked. The Tor browser looked like Firefox but ran slower than a geriatric turtle, because your internet traffic was bouncing through servers in Germany, Iceland, and Romania before reaching its destination. Once you had Tor running, you needed to find Silk Road's address. This wasn't something you could Google. The .onion addresses weren't indexed by search engines. You had to know where to look, usually on forums, Reddit, threads, or from friends who'd already made the journey. And even then, you had to be careful because scammers created fake Silk Road sites, phishing operations designed to steal your Bitcoin the moment you logged in. Let's say you successfully navigated to the real Silk Road. You'd see a homepage that looked surprisingly professional. Clean layout, organized categories, a search bar. It genuinely resembled Amazon, except the product categories were psychedelics, stimulants, cannabis, prescription drugs, and opioids, instead of books, electronics, and home and garden. You'd create an account using a username you'd hopefully never used anywhere else. Most people chose something anonymous and forgettable. User12345 or anonymous_buyer. Smart users created a new identity specifically for Silk Road and never connected it to their real-world identity in any way. Now came the Bitcoin problem. If you'd never bought cryptocurrency before, this part was genuinely confusing. You had to sign up for a Bitcoin exchange like Mt. Gox or Coinbase. Verify your identity. Yes, ironically, buying anonymous currency required providing your real information, link a bank account, and purchase Bitcoin. Then you had to transfer that Bitcoin from the exchange to a Tor-based wallet, and from there into your Silk Road account. Each transfer took time, involved transaction fees, and required you to copy and paste long cryptographic addresses without making a single typo, because one wrong character meant your money vanished into the digital void forever. Once your Bitcoin was finally sitting in your Silk Road account, the actual shopping part was easy. You'd browse categories, click on products, and read descriptions that sounded like they were written by professional copywriters. Premium Amsterdam MDMA, tested at 84% purity, shipped from Netherlands, vacuum sealed, double bagged, scent proof, arrives in 7 to 10 days. Each listing included multiple photos, the product itself, the packaging, sometimes even lab test results. The reviews were extensive and brutally honest. 5 stars, product exactly as described. Shipping was fast. Stealth packaging was excellent, came in a hollowed out book. Or 2 stars, product was weak, took 3 weeks to arrive. Vendor was unresponsive to messages, would not order again. You'd add items to your cart, proceed to checkout, and the Bitcoin would move from your account into escrow, a digital holding pattern where neither buyer nor vendor could access it. This protected both parties. If the vendor never shipped, you'd get refunded. If you tried to scam the vendor by claiming the product never arrived when it did, the escrow system and dread pirate Roberts would adjudicate. Then you waited. The vendor, often operating from another country, would receive your order, prepare the package with extreme care, and mail it through regular postal services. No FedEx or UPS, those companies X-ray packages and require signatures. Just standard mail, blending in with birthday cards and Netflix DVDs. 7 to 10 days later, a plain envelope would arrive in your mailbox. You'd open it, confirm the product was inside, log back into Silk Road, and finalize the transaction. The Bitcoin would release to the vendor, everyone would leave reviews, and the cycle would begin again. It was bureaucratic, slow, and required a learning curve. But once you figured it out, it was easier and safer than any street deal you'd ever done, and that's exactly why it worked. One of Silk Road's most genius innovations was its escrow system. In the traditional drug trade, trust is everything, and trust gets you killed. You never know if your dealer is going to rip you off, sell you fake product, or just rob you outright. Silk Road solved this with technology. When you placed an order, your Bitcoin didn't go directly to the vendor. It went into escrow, held by the site until you confirmed you'd received your product. If the drugs never showed up or were garbage, you could open a dispute and Dread Pirate Roberts would mediate. If the vendor was scamming, they'd be kicked off the platform and lose their reputation. If the buyer was lying, the vendor would still get paid. It was a system built on code, not violence. And for the first time in history, strangers on opposite sides of the planet could do illegal business together without ever meeting, without ever risking a confrontation, and with a reasonable expectation that both sides would hold up their end of the deal. Let's talk about why this was revolutionary. In any normal drug transaction, the power dynamic is completely lopsided. The dealer has the drugs, the buyer has the money. Once the exchange happens, there's no recourse. If you hand over cash and get fake product, too bad. You can't call the police. You can't file a complaint. Your only option is confrontation, which might mean violence, which might mean someone gets hurt or arrested. Street dealers knew this, and some absolutely took advantage. They'd sell oregano as weed, aspirin as ecstasy, or baking soda as cocaine. They'd short bags, claiming the scale was off. They'd ghost buyers after taking their money, and buyers had no leverage because what were they going to do? Leave a bad Yelp review? File a Better Business Bureau complaint? Silk Road flipped this entirely. The escrow system removed the trust requirement. You didn't have to trust the vendor, and the vendor didn't have to trust you. The code enforced the deal. When you placed an order, the Bitcoin was locked in escrow, visible to the vendor as pending, proving you'd paid, but not yet accessible. This gave the vendor confidence to ship the product. They knew the money was real and waiting. Meanwhile, you as the buyer had protection. If the vendor took your money and never shipped anything, you weren't just out of luck. You could open a dispute after a reasonable amount of time and the escrow system would freeze the transaction. Dread Pirate Roberts, acting as arbitrator, would review the evidence, shipping confirmations, communication logs, vendor history, and make a ruling. If the vendor was clearly scamming, the Bitcoin would be refunded to you, and the vendor would be banned. Their entire reputation, built over months of successful transactions, would be destroyed. This created powerful incentives for honest dealing. Vendors who consistently delivered quality product on time built up stellar reputations. Buyers would pay premium prices just to order from trusted vendors. A 5-star rating with hundreds of positive reviews was worth real money. It meant steady customers, higher prices, and long-term income. Scammers, on the other hand, were quickly identified and eliminated. If you created a vendor account, listed a bunch of fake products, took orders, and then never shipped anything, you might make money on the first round of scams. But within days, negative reviews would flood in, disputes would be opened, and you'd be permanently banned. And since creating a new vendor account required a bond, a deposit of several $100s in Bitcoin, getting banned meant losing that money too. The system wasn't perfect. Disputes did happen. Some buyers would claim they never received packages that actually arrived, hoping to get free drugs and a refund, a scam called FE scamming. FE stood for finalize early. Some vendors would pressure buyers to finalize early, releasing the Bitcoin before the product arrived, and then never ship anything. But Dread Pirate Roberts was surprisingly active in mediating disputes. He'd review evidence, make rulings, and generally tried to be fair. His incentive was clear. If Silk Road became known as a scam-riddled disaster, users would leave and his commission income would dry up. He needed the marketplace to be trustworthy, efficient, and functional, and it worked. For years it actually worked. Buyers and vendors complete. Strangers separated by oceans and borders conducted thousands of illegal transactions with a lower fraud rate than many legitimate e-commerce platforms. The escrow system turned the drug trade from a lawless free-for-all into something that almost resembled civilized commerce. It was honor among thieves, enforced not by guns or threats, but by lines of code and the cold logic of reputation economics. And for a brief, strange moment in internet history, it was the most honest criminal marketplace the world had ever seen. Silk Road wasn't just functional, it was polished. The site had a clean, intuitive interface that wouldn't have looked out of place on any legitimate e-commerce platform. You could sort products by category, filter by price, read detailed vendor profiles, and even message sellers directly with questions. Reviews were brutally honest. Buyers would rate product quality, shipping speed, and stealth packaging. If a vendor sent you oregano instead of weed, everyone would know within hours. The community forums were active and surprisingly friendly. People swapped harm reduction tips, discussed encryption techniques, and debated libertarian philosophy. It felt less like a criminal marketplace and more like a subculture, a digital nation of people who believed they were fighting for freedom, one Bitcoin transaction at a time. The attention to detail was remarkable. Ross had clearly studied how successful e-commerce sites functioned and replicated everything that worked. The search bar was responsive and actually useful. You could type high-quality MDMA and get relevant results, ranked by vendor, rating, and price. Filters let you narrow by location, domestic shipping versus international, or by drug purity, dosage, or form. Each product listing read like something from a boutique online shop. Professional photos showed the product from multiple angles. Descriptions were detailed and informative, often including chemical compositions, dosage, recommendations, and effect profiles. Some vendors wrote their descriptions like wine sommeliers reviewing a vintage. This LSD batch features clean, introspective visuals with minimal body load. Sourced from a legendary chemist. Tested at 110 micrograms per tab. Perfect for experienced psychonauts seeking deep introspection. The vendor profiles were equally thorough. Each seller had a page showing their total sales, average rating, response time, and shipping reliability. Many wrote introductory essays explaining their philosophy, their sourcing methods, and their commitment to quality. It was bizarrely professional. You'd read a vendor profile and think, this person could be selling handmade soap on Etsy, except they were selling heroin from Southeast Asia. The messaging system let buyers contact vendors before purchasing. You could ask questions: is this strain indica or sativa? Can you ship to Canada? Do you offer bulk discounts? And vendors would usually respond within hours. Good customer service wasn't optional. It was essential for building reputation. And then there were the reviews. Oh, the reviews. They were extensive, detailed, and often hilarious in their thoroughness. Buyers treated reviewing drugs on Silk Road like reviewing restaurants on Yelp. They'd rate categories separately: product quality, shipping speed, stealth, communication. They'd write paragraphs describing their experience. 5 stars. Ordered 1 gram of Peruvian cocaine. Arrived in 6 days. Double vacuum sealed inside a greeting card. Product was exactly as described, no cut, smooth come up, no jitters. Vendor was communicative and professional. Will definitely order again. Or 3 stars. MDMA was decent but weaker than advertised. Took longer to arrive than expected, 10 days instead of 7. Packaging was good though. Not bad, but not great. Or 1 star. Do not order from this vendor. Product never arrived. Vendor stopped responding to messages after I paid. Opened dispute and got refund, but wasted 2 weeks. These reviews created accountability. A vendor's reputation was their most valuable asset, and maintaining it required consistent quality, honest communication, and reliable shipping. The best vendors treated their Silk Road business like a legitimate startup. They invested in quality product, professional packaging, and excellent customer service, because that's what generated repeat customers and 5-star reviews. The forums were equally impressive. They were organized into sections: drug safety, security and anonymity, philosophy, off-topic, vendor discussion. Users posted threads about everything from best practices for testing MDMA purity to its taxation theft, to how to configure PGP encryption on Mac. The community was engaged, helpful, and surprisingly non-judgmental. There was a genuine sense of camaraderie. People weren't just buying drugs, they were participating in what they saw as a movement. They'd post success stories, share harm reduction information, and warn each other about law enforcement tactics or security vulnerabilities. Some threads read like support groups, others read like graduate seminars in libertarian economics. It was weird, fascinating, and deeply unsettling. Because the user experience was so smooth, so normal, so similar to shopping on any other website, that it was easy to forget you were participating in a massive criminal enterprise. The interface had domesticated drug trafficking, turned it into something casual and convenient. You could order heroin while sitting in a coffee shop, browsing on your laptop between emails, and it felt no different than ordering a book from Amazon. That normalization was perhaps Silk Road's most dangerous innovation. It removed the psychological barriers that might otherwise stop someone from buying drugs. No dark alleys, no scary dealers, no visceral reminders that what you were doing was illegal. Just a clean website, friendly vendors, and a checkout button. And that made it very, very easy to click buy now without thinking too hard about the consequences. Silk Road's vendors were a bizarre cross-section of humanity. Some were small-time dealers offloading personal stashes to pay rent. Others were underground chemists synthesizing designer drugs in makeshift labs. A few were international operations moving kilos of cocaine and heroin across borders using encrypted communication and dead drops. One of the most famous vendors was a user called Nod, who sold high-quality heroin and became something of a dark web celebrity. Another called Super Trips specialized in LSD and was known for beautiful blotter art and perfect stealth packaging. These weren't street thugs. They were entrepreneurs operating with spreadsheets, customer service skills, and business strategies. They offered bulk discounts, loyalty programs, and seasonal sales. They vacuum-sealed products in multiple layers, disguised packages as books or DVDs, and mailed from different countries to avoid detection. And they were making money, lots of it. Let's talk about what it actually took to be a successful Silk Road vendor, because it was way more complex than just have drugs, will ship. First you needed product, obviously. But you also needed consistent supply, reliable quality, and enough volume to fulfill orders without running dry. Small-time vendors might buy a few ounces of weed locally and resell it online. Larger operations worked directly with growers, chemists, or importers. Some vendors were true specialists. There were cannabis vendors who only sold specific strains, high CBD medical marijuana, exotic imports from Amsterdam, concentrated oils and edibles. There were psychedelic vendors who sourced rare compounds like 2CB, DMT, or mescaline. There were prescription drug vendors who somehow had access to pharmaceutical-grade opioids, benzodiazepines, and stimulants, often sourced from corrupt pharmacy employees or overseas manufacturers. And then there were the chemists. These were the most fascinating and dangerous vendors on Silk Road. They weren't buying product from someone else, they were synthesizing it themselves. Underground chemists making MDMA, LSD, or methamphetamine in home laboratories, following chemical procedures they'd learned from university coursework, old Alexander Shulgin books, or sketchy internet forums. These vendors could control purity, avoid contamination, and create product that was often cleaner and safer than street drugs. But being a vendor wasn't just about having drugs. It was about operational security, customer service, and business management. You needed to master stealth shipping, the art of concealing drugs so thoroughly that they'd pass through postal inspection undetected. Vendors developed elaborate techniques, vacuum sealing product multiple times to eliminate odor, disguising packages as ordinary mail, books, DVDs, greeting cards, using decoy layers, fake, product on the outside, real product hidden deeper, and mailing from public mailboxes in different cities to avoid patterns. Some vendors were obsessive about stealth. They'd include handwritten notes, gift wrap packages, or create completely convincing fake products. One legendary vendor allegedly shipped cocaine hidden inside hollowed-out candles. Another mailed MDMA concealed in the spine of actual bound books. The creativity was impressive and deeply illegal. Customer service was equally important. Successful vendors responded to messages quickly, answered questions professionally, and resolved problems diplomatically. They'd offer refunds or reships if packages got lost. They'd provide tracking numbers when possible. They'd warn customers about delays or quality issues. It was genuine customer service, just applied to felony drug trafficking. And then there was the reputation management. Vendors obsessively monitored their reviews, responding to complaints and thanking customers for positive feedback. A single string of bad reviews could destroy months of work. A consistently perfect rating could turn a vendor into a dark web brand, commanding premium prices and customer loyalty. The most successful vendors were making absurd amounts of money. Some operated as full-time businesses, processing dozens of orders daily, clearing thousands of dollars in profit every week. They hired assistants, people to handle packaging, shipping, customer service. They invested in better equipment, professional vacuum sealers, precision scales, secure communication devices. They were running startups, just illegal ones. But the risks were enormous. Every package mailed was a potential felony charge. Every customer was a potential undercover agent. Every day you operated increased the statistical likelihood of getting caught. Some vendors worked for months, made their money, and disappeared before law enforcement could identify them. Others got greedy, kept operating too long, and ended up in handcuffs when the police finally traced a package back to its source. There were also the ethical contradictions. Many vendors genuinely believed in what they were doing, that they were providing a service, that drug prohibition was unjust, that their customers were adults making informed choices. But they were also selling heroin, which destroys lives. They were selling cocaine sourced from cartels responsible for unimaginable violence. The mental gymnastics required to rationalize this was substantial. And yet, many vendors saw themselves as harm reduction advocates. They tested their products for purity. They included dosage information and safety warnings. They refused to sell to obviously desperate addicts. It was a strange moral framework, simultaneously caring and reckless, principled and opportunistic. Silk Road turned drug dealing from a street-level hustle into a white-collar operation. And for a few years, for some of these vendors, it actually worked, until the FBI came knocking. The people buying drugs on Silk Road weren't who you'd expect. Sure, there were addicts and hardcore users, but the majority were surprisingly normal. College students ordering MDMA for weekend raves, professionals microdosing LSD to boost creativity, suburban parents buying weed because it was safer than meeting a dealer in a parking lot. Some were libertarians making a political statement. Others were just curious. The dark web offered something the streets never could. Choice, safety and convenience. You could read reviews, compare prices and order from the comfort of your home. No sketchy alleyways, no violence, no undercover cops. It democratized drug access in a way that made law enforcement deeply uncomfortable. Let's profile some typical Silk Road customers because the range was genuinely surprising. First, the college kid. He's 20 years old, studying computer science, and heard about Silk Road on Reddit. He's curious about psychedelics, wants to try LSD but has no idea how to find it on campus. So he downloads Tor, follows a tutorial, buys $50 in Bitcoin, and orders 2 tabs of acid. 10 days later, they arrive in his dorm mailbox tucked inside a birthday card. He tries 1 tab that weekend, has a profound experience, and leaves a 5-star review. He'll order from Silk Road 3 more times over the next year before graduating and never using it again. Then there's the middle-aged professional. She's a 40-year-old marketing executive who suffers from chronic pain and anxiety. Her doctor prescribed opioids, which made her feel worse. Someone mentioned that marijuana might help, but she hasn't smoked weed since college and has no idea where to get it. She doesn't want to ask around at work or show up in some stranger's apartment. Then a friend mentioned Silk Road. She's skeptical, but desperate. She spends a weekend learning about Tor and Bitcoin, feeling like she's committing a felony just by reading about it. Finally, nervously, she orders a small amount of high CBD cannabis. It arrives discreetly. She tries it. It helps. She becomes a regular customer, ordering monthly, always carefully, always paranoid, but also grateful that this option exists. There's the libertarian activist who doesn't even use drugs but orders from Silk Road on principle. He believes prohibition is immoral and that Silk Road is a peaceful protest against government tyranny. He'll order small amounts of marijuana or mushrooms, leave detailed reviews about the quality of the transaction, and write forum posts about Austrian economics. For him, every purchase is a political act. And yes, there were addicts. People struggling with heroin dependency who found Silk Road offered better product, lower prices, and less risk than street dealing. Some saw it as harm reduction. At least the drugs were purer, less likely to be cut with fentanyl or other dangerous adulterants. Others just saw it as a more convenient way to feed their addiction. These were the users that troubled even some Silk Road supporters, because while the platform might reduce some harms, it also made it easier for people to spiral deeper into dependency. There were also the experimenters, the psychonauts, people fascinated by altered states of consciousness who treated drugs like tools for exploration. They'd order exotic psychedelics, research chemicals, dissociatives. They'd keep detailed trip reports, share experiences in forums, and discuss philosophy and phenomenology. For them, Silk Road was like a catalogue for consciousness exploration. And then there were the just plain curious. People who'd never done drugs, who had good jobs and stable lives, but who were intrigued by the idea of this hidden marketplace. Some ordered once just to see if it really worked. Others became regular customers, surprised by how easy and safe it felt. What united all these different customers was the appeal of the platform itself. Silk Road removed so many of the barriers and risks associated with buying drugs. You didn't have to know anyone. You didn't have to go anywhere dangerous. You didn't have to negotiate with strangers or worry about violence. You just browsed, clicked, and waited for the mail. It also offered unprecedented choice. On the street, you took what your dealer had. On Silk Road, you could compare dozens of vendors, read detailed descriptions, check lab tests, and choose exactly what you wanted. It was consumer empowerment applied to contraband. The convenience was intoxicating. You could browse Silk Road while sitting in your pajamas, drinking coffee, and watching Netflix. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Your brain knew you were buying illegal drugs, but your eyes saw a clean website that felt no different than Amazon. The interface normalized the illegal, made it casual and mundane. And that normalization was both Silk Road's genius and its danger. It lowered the psychological barriers to drug use. People who might never have bought drugs from a street dealer felt comfortable clicking buy now on a website. The consequences felt distant and abstract. After all, you weren't meeting anyone, you weren't in a dangerous neighborhood, you weren't doing anything that felt criminal. You were just shopping online. Silk Road didn't create drug users, but it made drug use accessible to people who would have never gone looking for it otherwise. And that's exactly what made it so revolutionary and so terrifying depending on where you stood. One of the strangest things about Silk Road was that it actually made drug use safer in some ways. On the street, you never really knew what you were getting. Your cocaine might be cut with baby laxative or fentanyl. Your ecstasy might be bath salts. But on Silk Road, reviews and reputation mattered. Vendors who sold dangerous or misrepresented products got called out immediately. The community had active harm reduction discussions. People shared drug testing results, dosage advice, and warnings about bad batches. Some vendors even included harm reduction literature with their shipments. Of course, this didn't make Silk Road a public health service. People still overdosed. People still got addicted. But compared to the chaotic, violent, unregulated street trade, Silk Road introduced a level of transparency and accountability that had never existed before. Let's talk about why this matters, because it's one of the most complicated and controversial aspects of Silk Road's legacy. In traditional street drug markets, information is scarce and often dangerously wrong. Your dealer tells you something is pure MDMA. Maybe it is. Maybe it's methylone, a research chemical with different effects and risks. Maybe it's mixed with methamphetamine. You have no way to know, no way to verify, and no recourse if you get sold something dangerous. This information asymmetry kills people. Every year, thousands die from drug overdoses, not because they intended to take a lethal dose, but because they didn't know what they were actually taking. Heroin cut with fentanyl. MDMA that's actually PMA, which has a much narrower safety margin. Cocaine mixed with levomisole, a livestock dewormer that destroys white blood cells. The street market is a biochemical roulette wheel. Silk Road didn't eliminate these risks, but it reduced them in several significant ways. First, the review system created accountability. If a vendor sold misrepresented or dangerous product, reviews would immediately reflect that. Warning: this vendor's MDMA is actually methylone, lab tested. Do not buy. That information would spread instantly through the community, and the vendor's reputation would be destroyed. Bad vendors couldn't survive in an ecosystem where information flowed freely. Second, many vendors actually took pride in product quality and purity. They'd include lab test results with shipments, showing the exact chemical composition and purity percentage. Some had their product tested by third-party services like Ecstasy Data or Energy Control, then posted the results in their vendor profile. This wasn't altruism, it was marketing. Lab-tested 87% pure MDMA commanded higher prices than mystery powder from an unknown source. Third, the forums became genuine harm reduction resources. There were entire threads dedicated to safe drug use, proper MDMA dosage and spacing, how to test your drugs at home, recognizing signs of overdose, mixing drugs safely, what works and what will kill you. Experienced users would mentor newcomers, explaining set and setting for psychedelics, safe dosing protocols for stimulants, and how to recognize when recreational use was becoming addiction. Some vendors went even further, including printed harm reduction information with orders. You'd receive your drugs along with a pamphlet explaining safe dosing, drug interactions to avoid, signs of overdose and contact information for poison. Control. It was surreal. Receiving heroin with a harm reduction guide was like buying cigarettes that came with quitting resources. Contradictory, yes, but also arguably better than no information at all. The Silk Road community also actively discussed drug testing. Users shared information about reagent test kits, chemicals that could identify substances through color reactions. They'd post photos of their test results, comparing them to known standards. Some users refused to consume anything they hadn't personally tested. This culture of verification was completely absent from street markets, where questioning your dealer's honesty could get you cut off or worse. But let's be absolutely clear, this wasn't a public health initiative. People still got addicted, people still overdosed, people still made terrible decisions while impaired. Silk Road made buying drugs easier, and easier access means more people using, which means more potential for harm. The harm reduction benefits were real but limited. There's also a darker irony here. While the community promoted safer drug use, they were simultaneously promoting drug use period. Teaching someone how to safely consume heroin doesn't change the fact that heroin is devastatingly addictive and ruins lives. All the lab testing and dosage guides in the world can't protect someone from the slow destruction of opioid dependency. Public health experts remain deeply divided on Silk Road's harm reduction impact. Some argue that any system providing better information and safer products is preferable to the completely unregulated street market. Others counter that by making drugs more accessible and normalizing their use. Silk Road likely increased overall harm even if it reduced harm per transaction. What's undeniable is that Silk Road represented a fundamentally different model of drug distribution, one where information, reputation, and consumer feedback created pressures toward quality and safety that simply don't exist. When transactions happen in dark parking lots between strangers who'll never see each other again. It was harm reduction by accident, a side effect of applying market forces to contraband. And while it didn't solve the problems created by drug prohibition, it did expose how much of the harm in drug markets comes not from the drugs themselves, but from the illegal, violent, unregulated systems through which they're distributed. Whether that justified Silk Road's existence is a question that still doesn't have an easy answer. By late 2012, Silk Road was processing millions of dollars in transactions every month. Ross Ulbricht, as Dread Pirate Roberts, was taking a commission on every sale, typically around 8 to 15%. That added up fast. Conservative estimates suggest that over Silk Road's 2.5 years of operation, it facilitated over 9 million transactions worth more than $1 billion. Ross himself accumulated a personal fortune in Bitcoin. At one point, his wallet contained over 144,000 Bitcoins, which, depending on when you calculate it, was worth anywhere from tens of millions to over $1 billion. But here's the problem with digital wealth. It's only worth something if you can actually spend it without getting caught. And Ross, increasingly paranoid and isolated, was sitting on a fortune he could barely touch. Let's break down the economics of Silk Road, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. Every time someone bought drugs on the platform, Ross took a cut. In the beginning, it was around 10%. Later, as the site grew and competition from other marketplaces emerged, he adjusted it, sometimes lowering it to stay competitive, sometimes raising it on high-value transactions. But on average, he was skimming 8 to 15% of every drug deal facilitated through his platform. Do the math. If Silk Road processed $1 million in sales in a single month, and by late 2012 it was doing much more, Ross was personally pocketing $80,000 to $150,000 per month just from commissions. He wasn't touching the drugs, wasn't taking any physical risk beyond running the servers, and was accumulating wealth faster than most startup CEOs. But there was a problem, a big one. All that wealth existed in Bitcoin, locked in digital wallets that were only accessible through cryptographic keys. Ross had the keys, which meant he controlled the fortune. But converting Bitcoin to usable cash without revealing his identity was nearly impossible at that scale. Small amounts? Sure, you could cash out through exchanges, mixing services, or Bitcoin ATMs, but 144,000 Bitcoins? That was a fortune large enough that moving any significant portion would send shockwaves through the entire Bitcoin market and attract immediate attention. So Ross was simultaneously incredibly wealthy and effectively broke. He lived modestly in a rented room in San Francisco. He didn't buy fancy cars or expensive clothes. He didn't live like a drug kingpin because he couldn't. Any large expenditure would raise questions. Where did this 20-something with no job get money to buy a house? How does someone with no visible income afford luxury vacations? He had to live like a struggling tech worker while sitting on a digital fortune that grew larger every day. And the value was growing fast. In early 2011, when Silk Road launched, Bitcoin was worth less than $1. By late 2012, it was worth over $10. By early 2013, over $30. Ross's commission earnings, already substantial, were appreciating wildly. Every Bitcoin he'd earned at $1 was now worth 30 times more without him doing anything. It was like owning stock in a company that kept skyrocketing. But here's another wrinkle. Vendors were also getting rich. The top vendors on Silk Road were processing hundreds of orders weekly. A successful MDMA vendor might clear $50,000 a month after expenses. A high-volume cannabis vendor could do even better. Some vendors were making more money than they'd ever imagined possible, all from their laptops, all through encrypted mail orders. And they faced the same problem Ross did. How do you actually spend drug money that exists entirely in Bitcoin without attracting attention? Some vendors were smart about it. They'd cash out slowly, in small amounts, through multiple exchanges and mixing services. They'd use Bitcoin ATMs that didn't require identification. They'd convert Bitcoin to gift cards, prepaid debit cards, anything that created distance between the digital currency and their real-world identity. Others got greedy or careless. They'd buy expensive items, cars, jewelry, real estate, and suddenly the IRS or local police would start asking questions about their unexplained wealth. Some vendors got caught not because law enforcement traced their Silk Road activity, but because they couldn't resist flaunting their illegal income. The total economic impact of Silk Road is hard to calculate precisely because so much happened in encrypted anonymity, but conservative estimates place the total transaction volume at over $1 billion during its operational life. That's billion with a B. $1 billion in illegal drugs flowing through a website run by a guy who'd been a grad student just a few years earlier. And Ross? His personal take from commissions likely exceeded $100 million, at least on paper. In reality, most of that wealth was trapped in Bitcoin, growing in value but impossible to access without risking everything. He was like a dragon sitting on a hoard of gold in a cave, fantastically wealthy but unable to spend a penny without revealing his location. The irony is almost poetic. Ross had built a marketplace based on freedom, on voluntary exchange, on the idea that people should be able to do what they wanted with their own money. And yet he'd imprisoned himself with wealth he couldn't use, trapped by the same system that had made him rich. He was the wealthiest prisoner in the world, and he didn't even know the walls were already closing in. Silk Road wasn't a utopia. Beneath the libertarian philosophy and customer reviews, there was darkness. Scammers constantly tried to game the system, fake vendors, phishing sites, and users trying to exploit escrow loopholes. Some buyers were law enforcement running sting operations, and then there were the really disturbing parts. In private messages, Ross allegedly discussed, and may have ordered, murders. One case involved a vendor who Ross believed had stolen money and was threatening to expose Silk Road users. Ross, according to chat logs later recovered by the FBI, arranged a hit, paying over $80,000 in Bitcoin to have the man killed. Another involved a blackmailer demanding money, or threatening to release user information. Ross allegedly paid for that hit too. Whether these murders actually happened remains murky. No bodies were ever found, and some believe the hitman was actually an undercover agent scamming Ross. But the conversations revealed something chilling. The idealistic philosopher king of the dark web was willing to kill to protect his empire. Let's talk about how the mask of Dread Pirate Roberts, the peaceful revolutionary who preached non-violence and voluntary exchange, completely shattered when Ross felt his empire was threatened. The transformation from idealistic libertarian to someone allegedly ordering contract killings is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Silk Road story. The first incident involved a user named Curtis Green, an employee Ross had hired to help manage Silk Road's day-to-day operations. Green had access to some of the site's internal systems and, according to Ross, had stolen Bitcoin. Whether Green actually stole anything or was set up remains disputed. But Ross became convinced that Green was both a thief and a liability who might expose the site to law enforcement. In the chat logs recovered by the FBI, Ross allegedly contacted someone he believed was a member of the Hells Angels, asking them to find Curtis Green, extract information about what Green had stolen, and then kill him. The price, $80,000 in Bitcoin. Ross allegedly sent photos of Green, his home address, and specific instructions. The Hells Angels member confirmed the hit, sent Ross photos of Green allegedly dead, actually staged by law enforcement, and collected the payment. Except here's the twist. The Hells Angels hitman was actually a corrupt DEA agent named Carl Force, who was running his own scam operation while supposedly investigating Silk Road. Green wasn't killed. The whole thing was theatre, designed to extract money from Ross while building a criminal case against him. But Ross didn't know that. As far as he was concerned, he'd just paid to have someone murdered, and it had worked. The second incident was even darker. A blackmailer who went by the name Friendly Chemist contacted Ross, threatening to release the personal information of thousands of Silk Road users unless paid off. Friendly Chemist claimed to have hacked a vendor's account and stolen customer data, names, addresses, purchase histories. He demanded $500,000 or he'd publish everything, destroying the anonymity that made Silk Road possible and likely getting users arrested. Ross, according to chat logs, responded by asking if Friendly Chemist had a supplier or anyone he worked with. The blackmailer mentioned someone named Red and White. Ross then allegedly contacted Red and White directly, claimed that Friendly Chemist owed him money, and offered to pay Red and White $150,000 to kill Friendly Chemist and his 3 roommates. The chat logs are chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. Ross negotiated price, asked for proof of death, and discussed timing like he was arranging a business transaction. Red and White allegedly agreed, carried out the hit, sent Ross photos of bodies, and received payment. But here's the thing. No bodies were ever found. No murder reports match the timeline or description. Some investigators believe Red and White was another scammer, taking Ross's money while faking photos. Others think Red and White might have been yet another undercover agent. The truth remains murky. What's undeniable is that Ross believed these murders had happened and felt justified ordering them. The philosophical writings of Dread Pirate Roberts, talked about non-aggression, voluntary exchange, and the immorality of violence. But when faced with actual threats to his empire, Ross abandoned those principles completely. He was willing to kill not in self-defense, not even in the heat of passion, but through cold, calculated, transactional murder for hire. The psychological transformation here is fascinating and horrifying. Ross started Silk Road believing he was creating a peaceful marketplace, a demonstration of how voluntary exchange could work without government coercion. But the moment his control was threatened, he defaulted to the oldest, most brutal form of power: violence. The libertarian dream had become indistinguishable from organised crime. Some Ross supporters argue he was entrapped, manipulated by corrupt agents who encouraged criminal behaviour. Others say the stress, isolation, and paranoia of running a criminal empire broke him psychologically. Maybe both are true, but the chat logs exist. The Bitcoin payments were made, and whether those murders actually happened or not, Ross believed they did and showed no remorse. The man who'd preached about freedom and morality had allegedly ordered multiple contract killings, discussing them in the same casual tone he'd used to discuss server maintenance or customer service policies. The revolution had eaten its own ideals, and Dread Pirate Roberts, the hero of the dark web, had become exactly the kind of violent criminal he claimed to oppose. By early 2012, Silk Road was too big to ignore. The FBI, DEA, IRS, and Homeland Security were all investigating, but they had a problem. They had no idea who was running the site or where the servers were hosted. Traditional law enforcement tactics didn't work. They couldn't raid an address or tap a phone line. The site existed in a digital ghost town, accessible only through Tor, with all financial transactions happening in Bitcoin. But the feds were patient. They started building a case from the outside in, tracking Bitcoin transactions, infiltrating the site as vendors and buyers, and analysing every scrap of digital evidence they could find. They called it Operation Marco Polo, and it would become one of the most complex cybercrime investigations in history. Let's talk about what it's like to investigate a crime that exists entirely in encrypted cyberspace. For decades, law enforcement had developed sophisticated techniques for tracking criminals: surveillance, wiretaps, informants, forensic evidence. But all of those methods assume the criminals existed in physical space. You could follow them, watch them, search their homes, intercept their communications. Silk Road made all of that irrelevant. The FBI couldn't surveil Ross because they didn't know who he was or where he was. They couldn't wiretap his communications because everything was encrypted through Tor. They couldn't search his home because they didn't know which of millions of possible homes to search. They were trying to catch a ghost who only existed as lines of code and pseudonymous usernames. So they started from what they could see: the website itself. Agents created accounts, browsed listings, and studied how the marketplace functioned. They posed as buyers, making small purchases to understand the transaction flow. They analysed the site's code, looking for vulnerabilities, identifying the server architecture, and mapping the system's security measures. Some agents went deeper, becoming vendors. They'd set up shops selling small amounts of drugs, usually marijuana, nothing too serious, and built up reputations. This gave them insight into the vendor side of the operation, how escrow worked, how disputes were handled, how Dread Pirate Roberts communicated with sellers. Every interaction was intelligence, every message a potential clue. Meanwhile, other teams focused on the money. Bitcoin's big advantage, pseudonymity, was also its weakness. While wallet addresses weren't directly connected to real identities, every transaction was permanently recorded on the blockchain. The FBI hired blockchain analysts who specialized in tracing Bitcoin flows. They'd follow the money backward from known drug busts, forward from Bitcoin exchanges where people converted cash to cryptocurrency, building maps of how money moved, through the dark web ecosystem. They discovered patterns. Certain wallets consistently received large commissions from Silk Road transactions, clearly Dread Pirate Roberts' personal accounts. They tracked how Ross moved Bitcoin between wallets, sometimes using mixing services to obscure the trail, but not always successfully. Every transaction left a permanent record, and the FBI was slowly connecting the dots. The IRS got involved too, because the IRS doesn't care about the morality of your income, they just want their cut. IRS criminal investigation agents, experts in following money through complex schemes, brought their forensic accounting skills to bear. They were particularly good at identifying the kind of operational security mistakes that criminals inevitably make. Reusing wallet addresses, cashing out through trackable exchanges, leaving digital breadcrumbs. Homeland Security and the DEA contributed their own expertise. Homeland Security focused on the packages working, with postal inspectors to identify drug shipments, track vendors, and map the physical distribution network that undergirded Silk Road's digital marketplace. The DEA brought their understanding of drug markets, helping agents pose convincingly as buyers and vendors. It was a coordinated, multi-agency effort, and it was slow, tedious work. For months they gathered evidence without making arrests, building a comprehensive picture of how Silk Road operated, who the major vendors were, and most importantly, who was running the show. But they still didn't know Ross's real identity. They knew Dread Pirate Roberts existed. They had chat logs, transaction records, and evidence of his involvement in the site's operations. But they didn't know his name, his location, or anything about his real-world identity. The investigation was comprehensive but incomplete. They were building a perfect case against a ghost, and then they caught their first break, not through sophisticated hacking or blockchain analysis, but through something much simpler, a username mistake made years earlier, buried in an old forum post waiting to be discovered. Sometimes the most advanced criminal operations fall apart not because of brilliant detective work, but because of a single moment of carelessness years before anyone was even looking. And Ross had been careless. Just once. But once was enough. Ross Ulbricht was smart, meticulous, and paranoid, but he wasn't perfect. In the earliest days of Silk Road before it became famous, Ross had made a rookie mistake. He'd promoted the site on a forum called Shroomery using his real email address. Then, just minutes later, he'd edited the post to replace it with a more anonymous contact. But the internet never forgets. An IRS agent named Gary Alford was combing through old forum posts when he noticed the edit. He traced the original email address and found that it belonged to someone named Ross Ulbricht from Austin, Texas. It was the first thread, and once they started pulling, everything began to unravel. Let's rewind to January 2011. Silk Road had just launched, and Ross was desperately trying to get the word out. The site was live, functional, and ready for business, but it had one critical problem. No one knew it existed. You can build the world's greatest marketplace, but if nobody shows up, it's just an empty website sitting in the darkness. So Ross did what any entrepreneur would do, he marketed it. He posted on drug forums where people discuss cannabis cultivation, psychedelic experiences, and where to find substances. Places like Shroomery, a mushroom-growing forum, and Reddit's drug-related subreddits. He wanted to reach the exact demographic who'd be interested. Drug users who were tech-savvy enough to figure out Tor and Bitcoin. On January 27th, 2011, Ross posted on Shroomery under the username Altoid. The post was straightforward, almost innocent. I came across this website, called Silk Road. It's a Tor hidden service that claims to allow you to buy and sell anything anonymously. I don't know if it's for real or not, but it looks promising. He included the .onion address and encouraged people to check it out. But here's the mistake. In that original post, Ross included a contact email for anyone who had questions. The email was rossulbricht@gmail.com. His actual name, his real email address, connected directly to his real identity. For someone trying to build an anonymous criminal empire, it was an astonishingly careless error. Ross realized the mistake almost immediately. Within minutes, maybe even seconds, he edited the post, replacing his real email with a more anonymous address, frosty@frosty.com. Problem solved, right? The internet would never notice a quick edit on an obscure forum thread, except the internet notices everything, and it never forgets. Fast forward to 2013, IRS Special Agent Gary Alford was part of Agent, the task force investigating Silk Road. While other agents focused on blockchain analysis and undercover operations, Alford took a different approach. He went searching through the archives, old forum posts, cached web pages, anywhere Silk Road had been mentioned in its earliest days. He found the Shroomery post. And because Internet Archives preserve edit histories, he found both versions, the original with Ross's real email, and the edited version with the anonymous contact. It was like finding a criminal's business card accidentally left at a crime scene. Alford ran the email address, Ross Ulbricht, Austin, Texas. He pulled up Ross's LinkedIn profile, Facebook page, Google Plus account. There was Ross, a real person, educated, articulate, with a history that matched the timeline. He'd studied physics, then materials science. He'd been in Austin during Silk Road's creation. His online presence showed libertarian leanings and an interest in Austrian economics, exactly the philosophical framework Dread Pirate Roberts espoused in his forum posts. It wasn't proof yet. Ross could argue he'd simply found the site and was promoting it, not running it. But it was a thread, a connection between the physical world and the digital phantom. And once the FBI had a name, they could start pulling on that thread. They began surveillance. They looked at Ross's financial records, travel history, social media activity. They tracked his movements and started building a profile. They discovered that Ross had moved to San Francisco in 2012. Around the same time, Silk Road's server management showed signs of being handled from the West Coast based on timestamp analysis. They found evidence of Ross asking questions on coding forums about Tor-hidden services and Bitcoin integration, exactly the technical challenges someone building Silk Road would need to solve. Each piece of evidence alone was circumstantial, but together they painted a picture. Ross Ulbricht wasn't just a user or a fan of Silk Road. He was connected to its creation, its promotion, and its operation. The FBI now had a target, a real person they could investigate using traditional methods. They pulled his passport records and found he'd travelled internationally to countries known for secure hosting services. They subpoenaed his bank records and found he had no visible legitimate income, but was paying rent and living expenses somehow. They examined his social media and found that his posting activity would go silent during periods when Dread Pirate Roberts was particularly active on Silk Road, then resume when DPR went quiet. The pattern was damning. But the FBI still needed more. They needed to catch Ross actually operating the site, logged in as Dread Pirate Roberts, with evidence that couldn't be explained away. They needed him at his computer, hands on the keyboard, unable to deny who he was. And so they started planning. Not a raid, not an arrest at his home where he'd have time to encrypt or destroy evidence. They needed to catch him in public. Laptop open, logged in, vulnerable. They needed to catch him in the act. One forum post, one email address, one moment of carelessness 3 years earlier. That's all it took. Ross had built elaborate security measures, used military-grade encryption, and operated through multiple layers of anonymity. But he couldn't undo a mistake he'd made before he knew anyone was looking. The internet never forgets, and neither does the IRS. While the FBI was closing in on Ross's identity, another team was hunting for Silk Road servers. Hosting a site on Tor is secure, but the servers still have to exist somewhere physically. After months of digital forensics and international cooperation, investigators track the servers to a data center in Iceland. But here's where it gets complicated. Seizing the servers wasn't enough. They needed to do it without tipping off Ross, because if he suspected the feds were close, he could destroy evidence, flee the country, or shut down the site entirely. So they waited, watching, gathering evidence, and building an airtight case. Let's talk about the technical challenge here, because finding Silk Road servers was like playing the world's highest stakes game of hide and seek. Tor hidden services are designed to be untraceable. When you visit a normal website, your request travels directly to a server with a physical location. But with Tor hidden services, your request bounces through multiple encrypted nodes before reaching the server, and the server's response bounces back through a different random path. Neither side knows where the other is physically located. But servers, no matter how well hidden, leave traces. They consume electricity, generate heat, and communicate with the internet through physical connections. The FBI's technical team started looking for those traces. They analysed timing patterns, the slight delays in server responses that could reveal geographical location. They studied the site's uptime and compared it to power outage patterns in different regions. They monitored Bitcoin transactions from Ross's personal wallets and looked for patterns that might correlate with server hosting payments. One breakthrough came from a configuration error. Silk Road's server briefly leaked its actual IP address during a login sequence, a tiny mistake in how the site handled certain types of traffic. That IP address, visible for just milliseconds, was captured by FBI monitoring systems. It pointed to a server hosted in Iceland, a country known for strong data privacy laws and popular with people running sensitive operations. Iceland's privacy protections meant the FBI couldn't just storm in and seize equipment. They needed cooperation from Icelandic authorities, which required navigating international law, treaties, and diplomatic protocols. They needed to prove that Silk Road wasn't just hosting controversial content but was actively facilitating serious crimes. They compiled evidence, drug trafficking, money laundering, possibly murder for hire. The Icelandic government agreed to cooperate, but with conditions. Any evidence seized had to be obtained legally under Icelandic law. The operation had to be coordinated carefully to preserve evidence without alerting the site's administrator. And critically, the server seizure had to be timed perfectly with Ross's arrest. If they grabbed the servers but Ross was still free, he could destroy evidence, warn vendors, or spin up new servers in a different country within hours. So the FBI sat on this information for months. They knew where the servers were, they had access, they could have shut down Silk Road at any moment, but shutting down the site without catching Ross would have been a hollow victory. He'd just rebuild it, more carefully this time, learning from whatever mistakes had led to the first takedown. Instead, they watched. They monitored traffic. They identified major vendors by tracking Bitcoin flows and correlating them with seized drug shipments. They mapped the entire ecosystem, who the big players were, where packages were being mailed from, which vendors had the largest operations. Every day they waited was another day of evidence collection, another vendor identified, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The technical team also worked on cloning the servers. They couldn't just seize the physical hardware without creating a perfect copy first. Silk Road servers contained encrypted databases with user information, transaction histories, and most importantly, Ross's administrative files. If anything went wrong during the seizure, if the drives were damaged or the encryption keys were lost, years of investigation would be wasted. So they developed a plan to simultaneously seize the physical servers in Iceland and capture Ross's laptop while it was unlocked and logged in. The server seizure would preserve all the back-end data. The laptop capture would provide the encryption keys and administrative access. Together they'd have everything: the infrastructure, the evidence, and the man running the show. The coordination required was extraordinary. Teams in Iceland, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. all had to move at precisely the same moment. Too early, and Ross could be alerted by server errors or downtime. Too late, and he might log out, encrypt his drives, or destroy evidence. The window for success was measured in seconds. Meanwhile, Ross had no idea any of this was happening. From his perspective, Silk Road was running smoothly. Traffic was growing. Revenue was increasing. His operational security seemed intact. He was still Dread Pirate Roberts, the untouchable ghost of the dark web, building his libertarian empire one transaction at a time. He didn't know that the servers he logged into every day were being monitored by federal agents. He didn't know that every keystroke, every administrative action, every message he sent was being recorded and analysed. He didn't know that the invisible shield of Tor and encryption that he'd trusted completely had already been penetrated. The trap was set. The servers were located. The evidence was being compiled. All that remained was catching Ross at exactly the right moment, vulnerable, exposed, unable to delete anything or disappear into the encrypted darkness he'd built his empire within. And that moment was coming soon. By 2013, Ross Ulbricht was living in San Francisco, renting a small room in a shared house and spending most of his days in coffee shops and libraries with his laptop. To his roommates and friends, he seemed like just another tech bro working on a startup. He was polite, quiet, and kept to himself. But in reality, Ross was managing a criminal empire from public Wi-Fi networks, juggling multiple online identities, and sitting on a Bitcoin fortune he couldn't spend. The psychological toll was immense. He was constantly paranoid, convinced that law enforcement was closing in. He stopped trusting people, stopped sleeping normally, and started making increasingly erratic decisions. The idealistic kid from Austin was gone, replaced by someone hardened, isolated, and willing to do terrible things to protect Silk Road. Let's talk about what Ross's daily life actually looked like in those final months. He'd wake up in his tiny rented room in the Glen Park neighborhood, a modest space with a bed, a desk, and not much else. He lived cheaply despite his hidden wealth. Cheap clothes, cheap food, no luxuries. He couldn't afford to raise any red flags about unexplained income. He'd pack his laptop, always encrypted, always password protected with multiple layers of security. Then he'd walk to a different coffee shop or library than he'd used the day before. Never the same place twice in a row. Never a pattern that could be tracked. He'd buy a coffee, find a corner booth with his back to the wall so no one could see his screen, and log into Tor. From that corner booth, sipping a latte that cost $4, Ross would become Dread Pirate Roberts. He'd spend hours managing the site, mediating vendor disputes, responding to security concerns, monitoring transactions, and watching Bitcoin pour into his wallets. He was running a business that processed millions of dollars monthly, and he was doing it from public spaces surrounded by oblivious people working on their own laptops, writing novels or job applications, completely unaware that the guy next to them was operating the world's largest drug marketplace. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. He'd see police officers walk into the coffee shop and his heart would race. He'd wonder if every stranger who glanced at his screen was an undercover agent. He started using multiple laptops, switching between them to compartmentalize different aspects of his operation. He'd keep one for general, browsing, another exclusively for Silk Road, another for managing Bitcoin wallets. His social life disintegrated. He had a girlfriend, Julia, who lived in Austin. He'd fly back occasionally to see her, but he couldn't tell her what he was really doing. She thought he was working on a startup, maybe day trading Bitcoin. He'd tell her vague stories about projects and consulting work, and she'd ask why he never seemed to have any money despite supposedly being successful. He'd deflect, change the subject, promise things would get better soon. His roommates barely knew him. He'd come and go at odd hours, spend days in his room without emerging, then suddenly disappear for weeks. He was friendly but distant, present but not really there. One roommate later told reporters that Ross seemed stressed, wound tight, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't put down. And he was. Ross was carrying the weight of Silk Road entirely alone. He couldn't share it with anyone. He couldn't complain about his problems or celebrate his successes. When a vendor got arrested and he worried about what they might tell police, he had no one to talk to. When revenue hit a new milestone, he celebrated silently in his room. When he allegedly ordered someone murdered, he processed that moral decision in complete isolation. The paranoia was rational but corrosive. He knew law enforcement was investigating. He'd seen news articles about Silk Road, senators calling for it to be shut down, law enforcement officials vowing to catch whoever was running it. He knew it was only a matter of time. Every day felt like borrowed time, every successful transaction like dodging a bullet. He started making mistakes, small ones at first, then bigger. He got sloppy about separating his real identity from his DPR persona. He'd post on Stack Overflow, a programming forum, asking technical questions about Tor and server configuration, using his real name. He'd access Silk Road from the same IP address. Multiple times, creating patterns. He'd reuse pseudonyms across different platforms. Each mistake was tiny, but they were accumulating. Sleep became difficult. He'd lie awake at night, running through security protocols in his mind, wondering if he'd forgotten something, if there was a vulnerability he'd overlooked. He'd dream about prison, about being caught, about losing everything. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and immediately check Silk Road on his phone, making sure the site was still up, still functioning. His health declined. He wasn't eating well, wasn't exercising, wasn't taking care of himself. He looked gaunt in photos from that period, tired around the eyes, older than his 29 years. The stress was literally aging him. And through all of this, he maintained the persona of Dread Pirate Roberts, calm, philosophical, in control. On the forums, he'd write thoughtful posts about liberty and markets. He'd mediate disputes with patience and wisdom. He'd present himself as a leader, a visionary, someone who had everything under control. But behind the screen, Ross Ulbricht was falling apart, isolated, paranoid, and trapped in a life he'd built but could no longer escape. He wanted to walk away. There are chat logs where he discusses this, telling confidants that he's tired, that he wants out, but he couldn't figure out how. Silk Road was too valuable to abandon. Shutting it down would mean losing his fortune. Selling it or transferring control would mean trusting someone not to betray him. And just disappearing would mean leaving behind evidence that could eventually be traced back to him. So he kept going, day after day, sitting in coffee shops, managing his empire, waiting for something to break. He didn't know it, but that break was coming soon. The FBI was closing in, agents were tracking his movements, and the plan to catch him was nearly complete. Ross was living on borrowed time, managing criminal enterprise in public spaces, wearing a mask of normalcy while drowning in paranoia. And he had no idea that in just a few weeks, everything would end in a public library, with FBI agents grabbing his laptop before he could close it, exposing every secret he'd spent years protecting. The double life was almost over, and the crash was going to be spectacular. On October 1st, 2013, Ross Ulbricht walked into the Glen Park Library in San Francisco with his laptop. He had no idea that FBI agents had been tracking him for weeks. They'd identified him, confirmed his identity, and were now just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Ross logged into Silk Road as Dread Pirate Roberts, an undercover agent, posing as a corrupt government employee, had been messaging Ross, offering to sell insider information. Ross agreed to meet, well, virtually, and logged in to continue the conversation. That's when the trap snapped shut. Two agents staged a loud, fake domestic dispute near Ross, drawing his attention away from his laptop for just a second. In that instant, another agent grabbed the computer before Ross could close it or encrypt it. He was arrested on the spot, laptop open, logged in as Dread Pirate Roberts, with no way to deny who he was. Let's walk through how this went down, because the planning was meticulous and the execution was flawless. The FBI had been watching Ross for weeks, tracking his movements around San Francisco. They knew he worked from coffee shops and libraries, always in public spaces, never staying in one place too long. They knew he used multiple laptops and was obsessive about security, and they knew that if they raided his home, he'd have time to encrypt everything, delete evidence, or claim he wasn't actually Dread Pirate Roberts, just someone interested in the site. They needed to catch him in the act, logged in, with his laptop unlocked and displaying evidence of his identity. But how do you approach someone in a public space, grab their laptop before they can close it, and make an arrest without them having even a second to react? The FBI's plan was brilliant and theatrical. They needed a distraction, something that would pull Ross's attention completely away from his screen for just long enough to grab the laptop. So they planned a fake domestic dispute. Two agents, posing as a couple, would start a loud argument near Ross. Nothing violent, just the kind of uncomfortable public fight that makes everyone nearby turn and look. On October 1st, Ross settled into his usual spot in the Glen Park Library. It was afternoon, quiet, with a handful of other people studying or browsing. Ross pulled out his laptop connected to the library's Wi-Fi through Tor and logged into Silk Road as Dread Pirate Roberts. At that moment, FBI agents were positioned throughout the library. Some posed as students studying. Others lurked near exits. One agent was specifically positioned behind Ross, close enough to reach his laptop in one quick movement. They were all waiting for the signal. The signal came when Ross logged in and began actively managing the site. An undercover agent, who'd been messaging Ross as Eladio, a corrupt government insider offering to sell sensitive information about the Silk Road investigation, sent Ross a new message. Ross opened it, fully engaged in the conversation, both hands on the keyboard. That's when the fake couple near Ross started their staged argument. It was loud enough to draw attention, but not so dramatic that it seemed dangerous. Just an uncomfortable public lovers' quarrel. Ross, like everyone else in the library, turned his head to see what was happening. In that fraction of a second, Special Agent Thomas Kiernan lunged forward and grabbed Ross's laptop. Not closed it, not pushed it away, grabbed it completely, yanking it out of Ross's reach before he could even process what was happening. Ross's hands were still in typing position, frozen mid-keystroke, when another agent grabbed him from behind. "FBI, you're under arrest." The library erupted in confusion. Other patrons scrambled out of the way. FBI agents swarmed in from every direction, securing the scene, preventing anyone from interfering. Ross didn't fight. He didn't scream or resist. He just sat there, stunned, as agents handcuffed him and read him his rights. His laptop, still open, still logged in, was carefully secured. The screen showed Silk Road's admin panel, Dread Pirate Roberts' dashboard, complete with transaction logs, vendor communications, and most damningly, Ross's username displayed at the top. They had him, completely. The laptop was unlocked, unencrypted, logged in. Every file, every conversation, every Bitcoin wallet was accessible. Ross had spent years building elaborate security measures, but in that moment, none of it mattered. The FBI had caught him with his digital pants down, sitting in a public library, managing his drug empire in broad daylight, as agents led Ross out of the library in handcuffs. One thing became immediately clear to everyone watching. This wasn't some low-level dealer or small-time hacker. The number of federal agents involved, the precision of the operation, the seriousness on everyone's faces, this was a major arrest. Someone important had just been caught. News spread quickly. Within hours, tech blogs and news outlets were reporting that a major dark web figure had been arrested in San Francisco. Within days, the world knew his name. Ross Ulbricht, the 29-year-old from Austin, Texas, who'd been operating as Dread Pirate Roberts, the founder and administrator of Silk Road. The laptop seizure was the key. Without it, Ross might have claimed he was researching Silk Road, or that someone else had used his identity, or that the evidence was circumstantial. But there's no arguing with a laptop, unlocked, logged in, displaying your administrative dashboard with your username on it. It was like being caught standing over a dead body, holding a smoking gun with your fingerprints everywhere. Ross had built an empire in the shadows, operated for years without being caught, and accumulated a fortune in the process. And it all ended in a public library, brought down by a fake argument and one quick laptop grab. The revolutionary who'd preached about freedom was now in federal custody, facing charges that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. The digital age had produced a new kind of criminal kingpin, one who could run a global drug network from coffee shops and libraries, never touching the product, never meeting his customers, operating entirely through code and cryptocurrency. But in the end, Ross was still flesh and blood, still vulnerable to old-fashioned police work and a well-executed arrest. The empire of the dark web had fallen not to hackers or cyber warriors, but to FBI agents staging a domestic dispute in a quiet neighborhood library. And just like that, Silk Road's untouchable administrator was very, very touchable. The mask of Dread Pirate Roberts had been ripped away, and underneath was just Ross, scared, caught, and completely out of options. Ross's laptop was a gold mine. It contained everything: encrypted chat logs, financial records, server access credentials, and a personal journal where Ross had documented Silk Road's creation and growth like some kind of criminal memoir. He'd written about his fears, his ambitions, and his belief that he was changing the world. He'd even kept a spreadsheet tracking every Bitcoin transaction and commission he'd earned. It was like finding a handwritten confession at a crime scene. The feds also recovered his personal Bitcoin wallets, containing over 144,000 Bitcoins. At the time of his arrest, that was worth around $28 million. Today, it would be worth billions. Let's talk about what was actually on that laptop, because Ross had essentially kept a perfect record of his own crimes. It's almost incomprehensible that someone so careful about operational security would keep such detailed, incriminating documentation. But he did, and it destroyed any possible defense he might have mounted. First, there was the journal. Ross had kept a personal log, a digital diary documenting Silk Road's creation from day one. He wrote about his motivations, his philosophy, his daily challenges running the site. Entries read like a startup founder's blog, except the startup was a drug marketplace. Created the first Silk Road transaction today. Feels surreal to see it actually working. Revenue hit $1 million monthly. Can't believe how fast this is growing. Had to make a difficult decision today regarding security threats. Hope it was the right call. The journal included timestamps, detailed descriptions of technical implementations, and reflections on the moral implications of what he was doing. It was simultaneously a confession, a manifesto, and a business diary. Prosecutors must have been giddy reading it. Ross had essentially written their closing argument for them. Then there were the chat logs. Years of conversations as Dread Pirate Roberts, preserved in encrypted files that were now completely accessible because the laptop was unlocked. These included the alleged murder-for-hire discussions, conversations with vendors about site operations, disputes with users, and administrative decisions. The FBI could trace every major event in Silk Road's history directly to Ross's laptop, matching chat timestamps with site events. The financial records were equally damning. Ross had kept meticulous spreadsheets tracking his commission income, operational expenses, and Bitcoin holdings. He documented every major transaction, categorized revenue sources, and even calculated his effective tax liability, which he obviously wasn't paying. It was like finding a drug kingpin's complete accounting ledger, except instead of paper ledgers that could be burned, it was digital evidence that had been preserved forever. The laptop also contained the cryptographic keys to Silk Road servers. With these keys, the FBI could access everything: the entire user database, transaction histories, vendor information, administrative logs. They could see every message ever sent on the site, every dispute resolution, every banned user. It was a complete archive of Silk Road's entire existence. Even more incredibly, Ross had taken screenshots. Why? Maybe for personal records, maybe for troubleshooting, maybe just because he was proud of what he'd built. But those screenshots showed him logged in as Dread Pirate Roberts, displayed administrative panels with his username, and documented actions he'd taken as site administrator. Any possible claim that someone else had been using his computer, or that he'd been set up, evaporated when prosecutors showed the jury screenshots taken from Ross's own laptop, showing him actively managing Silk Road. The Bitcoin wallets were the cherry on top. The FBI traced Ross's wallet addresses and confirmed they matched the wallets that had received commission payments from Silk Road transactions. The blockchain doesn't lie. Every commission payment, every withdrawal, every transfer was permanently recorded. They could prove, mathematically and cryptographically, that Ross controlled the wallets that had profited from Silk Road. But perhaps most damaging was the sheer volume of evidence showing Ross's operational control. He hadn't just founded Silk Road and walked away. He'd been actively managing it right up until his arrest. The laptop showed recent logins, recent messages, recent administrative actions. There was no argument that he'd left the site or passed control to someone else. Ross was Dread Pirate Roberts, and he'd been caught red-handed. What's fascinating is why Ross kept all this evidence. He was smart enough to build Silk Road, smart enough to evade law enforcement for years, but not smart enough to delete his criminal diary. The psychology here is complex. Maybe he thought his encryption was unbreakable, and the laptop would never be seized while unlocked. Maybe he wanted documentation for a memoir he planned to write someday. Maybe he was just organizationally meticulous by nature and couldn't help keeping records. Or maybe on some level Ross wanted to be caught. Maybe the isolation, the paranoia, the weight of running a criminal empire had become unbearable, and keeping evidence was a subconscious form of self-sabotage. We'll never know for sure. But what's undeniable is that Ross made the prosecution's job incredibly easy. Defense attorneys talk about the golden hour after an arrest, the brief window when evidence can be suppressed, statements can be retracted, and legal strategies can be deployed. Ross's golden hour was worthless. The evidence was so overwhelming, so detailed, and so clearly connected to him personally that there was no defense strategy that could save him. The laptop didn't just prove Ross was guilty, it documented every aspect of his guilt in exhausting detail, written in his own words, saved in his own files, accessible because he'd been caught at the exact moment when all his security measures were temporarily disabled. It was the perfect storm of evidence, and it was about to bury him. Within hours of Ross's arrest, the FBI seized Silk Road servers and shut the site down. When users tried to log in, they were greeted with a message, This hidden site has been seized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The dark web exploded with panic, speculation, and disbelief. Vendors scrambled to cover their tracks. Buyers worried their information had been compromised. And somewhere, someone inevitably said, "I told you this was too good to be true." Let's talk about what it felt like when Silk Road went dark. For thousands of users, it was like waking up to find your entire city had vanished overnight. One moment, Silk Road was there, functional, active, processing transactions. The next moment it was gone, replaced by a stark FBI seizure notice that felt like a punch to the gut. The forums on other dark websites exploded immediately. Is Silk Road down for anyone else? I can't connect. Is it just me? Then someone posted a screenshot. The FBI notice, official, unmistakable, terrifying. The panic spread like wildfire. Users who had Bitcoin in their Silk Road wallets realized that money was gone, seized by federal agents. Vendors who'd been in the middle of preparing shipments didn't know whether to send them or burn everything and run. The paranoia was intense and justified. If the FBI had seized the servers, they had everything. Usernames, transaction histories, messages, Bitcoin addresses. Users who'd been careful about their identities started wondering if they'd made mistakes, left breadcrumbs, said too much in unencrypted messages. Had they ever mentioned their real location? Had they reused usernames from other sites? Had they been sloppy about their operational security? Vendors faced the worst exposure. Many had processed hundreds or thousands of orders, each one containing a real shipping address. If the FBI had that data, and they did, they could potentially identify and arrest every major vendor on the platform. Some vendors had been operating for years, accumulated fortunes, built reputations. All of that was now in federal custody. The immediate response was chaos. Some vendors went into hiding, abandoning their homes and businesses. Others frantically destroyed evidence, burning packaging materials, dumping drug supplies, wiping hard drives. The smart ones had prepared for this scenario, keeping their operations compartmentalized and their identities protected. The careless ones were about to find out exactly how careless they'd been. Buyers worried about different things. Would the FBI come after customers or just vendors? Most experts agreed law enforcement would focus on high-level targets, administrators, major vendors, large buyers, rather than someone who'd bought a couple grams of weed. But probably isn't reassuring when you're staring at a federal seizure notice and wondering if agents are about to knock on your door. The media picked up the story instantly. Underground drug website Shutdown was front-page news across the country. News broadcasts showed the FBI seizure notice, explained what Silk Road was, and interviewed shocked law enforcement officials who praised the operation while admitting they'd been chasing this site for years. Suddenly, millions of people who'd never heard of the dark web were learning about Tor, Bitcoin, and the invisible marketplace that had been operating under everyone's noses. Politicians pounced. Senators held press conferences, praising the FBI and calling for more resources to fight dark web crime. Some demanded legislation requiring Bitcoin exchanges to report suspicious transactions. Others wanted to restrict Tor usage. The national conversation had shifted from what's Silk Road to how do we prevent the next Silk Road. But on the dark web itself, the reaction was more complex. Some users were genuinely devastated. Silk Road had been more than a marketplace. It had been a community, a movement, a demonstration that alternative systems were possible. They'd believed in what Dread Pirate Roberts preached, and now their digital hero was in custody. Their marketplace was seized, and their revolution was apparently over. Others were cynical. Of course it got shut down. Nothing lasts forever. They'd always known this would happen eventually and had been careful not to get too invested. For them, Silk Road's closure was just another chapter in the eternal cat-and-mouse game between criminals and law enforcement. And then there were the opportunists. Within hours, literally hours, of Silk Road's closure, new marketplaces started popping up. Silk Road is gone, but we're here. They copied Silk Road's interface, promised better security, and tried to capture the displaced user base. Some were legitimate attempts to fill the void. Others were obvious scams, honeypots run by law enforcement, or just thieves looking to steal Bitcoin from panicked users. The message on Silk Road's seized page stayed up for weeks, a digital tombstone marking where the marketplace had been. It was a warning and a trophy. The FBI had won this round, but anyone paying attention could see that the war was far from over. Silk Road might be dead, but the infrastructure that made it possible, Tor, Bitcoin, encrypted communication, was still there. The demand hadn't disappeared. The vendors hadn't all been arrested. And sure enough, within weeks, Silk Road 2.0 was announced. A new administrator, claiming to be the true heir to Dread Pirate Roberts' legacy, launched a successor site. It looked almost identical to the original, used the same escrow system, and promised the same security. Users flocked to it, desperate to recreate what they'd lost. The FBI had cut off the head, but they hadn't killed the Hydra. If anything, they'd proven that the concept worked. Silk Road had operated successfully for 2.5 years, facilitated over $1 billion in transactions, and made its creator wealthy beyond imagination. That success, ironically, guaranteed that others would try to replicate it. Silk Road was gone, but the dark web drug trade was just getting started. So here we are. The story of how the internet created the world's biggest drug market, not with violence, not with cartels on street corners, but with code, encryption, and a kid from Austin who thought he could revolutionize crime from a coffee shop. Ross Ulbricht sits in a federal prison tonight, serving life without parole for building a website. He'll never walk free. His fortune in Bitcoin, worth billions now, sits in government custody, frozen forever. The empire he built, the philosophy he preached, the revolution he promised, all of it ended in a library with FBI agents grabbing his laptop before he could close it. His double life collapsed in seconds, and the mask of Dread Pirate Roberts fell away to reveal just Ross, scared, caught, human. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Silk Road worked. For 2.5 years, it functioned exactly as designed. It made buying drugs safer in some ways, more convenient in others, and completely changed how we think about crime, commerce, and anonymity. It proved that with the right technology, you could build $1 billion criminal empire that law enforcement couldn't touch, at least not for a while. And even when they finally caught Ross, even when they threw him in prison for life, they couldn't kill what he'd created. The Hydra grew new heads, the marketplaces multiplied, the technology spread. Was Ross a hero or a villain? A freedom fighter or a drug kingpin? A visionary or a criminal who enabled addiction and suffering? The answer depends entirely on where you stand. To his supporters, he's a political prisoner, punished for challenging government authority and demonstrating that prohibition doesn't work. To his critics, he's exactly where he belongs, a man who profited from human misery, who allegedly ordered murders, and who hid behind philosophy while poison flowed through the mail. What's undeniable is that Ross changed the world. He showed that the drug war as currently fought is fundamentally unwinnable. You can't arrest your way out of a problem that exists in code. You can't build walls around the internet. You can't stop encryption, cryptocurrency, or human beings who want to buy and sell things without government permission. Silk Road exposed all of this, whether we wanted to see it or not. The dark web still hums with marketplaces tonight. Vendors still ship packages. Buyers still click purchase. The technology Ross pioneered, escrow systems, reputation economies, encrypted communication, has been refined and improved, and somewhere, someone is probably building the next Silk Road right now, learning from Ross's mistakes, implementing better security, and believing they'll be the one who doesn't get caught. Maybe they will be. Maybe they won't. But the cycle continues, endless and inevitable, because the fundamental problem hasn't changed. There's demand for drugs, there's supply, and prohibition creates a black market. Technology just moved that market from street corners to servers, from violence to code, from dealers to administrators who look like tech bros and operate from libraries. Ross believed he was fighting for freedom. Maybe he was. Or maybe he was just a smart kid who got in over his head, who built something he couldn't control, who became the very thing his philosophy claimed to oppose, someone willing to use violence to protect power. We'll never fully know what was in his heart, only what was on his laptop, so tonight as you scroll, through your phone on a secure network, buying things with a few taps, trusting systems you don't fully understand, maybe think about Ross Ulbricht. Think about how thin the line is between innovation and crime, between revolution and recklessness, between freedom and chaos. Think about how the internet doesn't just connect us, it transforms us, enables us, and sometimes traps us in systems we build but can't escape. Because Ross built his empire, and then his empire buried him. The technology that gave him power became the evidence that destroyed him. The anonymity he promised others never quite protected him. And the revolution he preached about. It's still happening, somewhere in the encrypted darkness, run by people who learned from his mistakes and are determined not to make them. The internet created the world's biggest drug market, but it also created the perfect cage for the man who built it. And whether that's justice, tragedy, or just the inevitable conclusion of a story that was always going to end this way, well, that's for you to decide. Sleep well, and maybe check your mailbox in the morning. You never know what might be waiting there, wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic and shipped from halfway around the world by someone you'll never meet. The digital age is strange like that, convenient, anonymous, and more than a little terrifying. Good night.